Welcome everyone to this MSSO webinar for General Principles on Coding of Medication Errors with MedDRA. My name is Suzanne Ensur Shaker or Shaker, both pronunciations are correct. I'll be your instructor for today. And joining me is my colleague Hannah Eaton, who is an MSSO training coordinator. And Hannah will kindly facilitate our session for today, and she'll be monitoring the chat panel. So if you have questions as we go through the slides, please post them in the chat, and Hannah will keep an eye on them and will address them during our Q&A session. Okay, so let's start with introductions. So I am a medical officer with the MSSO team. I'm based in New Jersey on the East Coast of the United States. Prior to that, I've had about 20 years or so experience in the industry, mainly in the world of clinical research within different functional groups. And we will be using the POL-EV tool today for some hands-on exercises later on in this session. So at this time, I do invite you to log on to the URL you see on the screen or scan the QR code so you can test out the tool and answer a few questions that will help us get to know you a little bit better. And it will also give you the chance to test out the tool. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to access the tool and see the first question asking you where you're calling from. And just a note that the tool is anonymized. So if it asks you for a username, you can skip that part. And just a quick housekeeping item that the webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. We do have a large amount of material to cover today, so we'll go through the instructional part of it first and leave time at the end for questions and answers. And if you have questions after the conclusion of the webinar, or if you have a question that takes a little bit more review and to answer, please feel free to reach out to us via our help desk, and we'll be happy to address your questions. Okay, so let's see if we're getting responses. That's wonderful. So the tool is working. You guys are able to access it, and I see folks from many different parts of the world, which is always fun for us to see, and it's really a testament to the widespread use and application of MedDRA on a global scale. So although I like to stay on this slide, I do need to move on for interest of time. So the question that I'm always interested in is, what roles and functions do you perform, whether currently or in a previous life? And you can choose as many as apply to you. This helps us get an idea of the audience we have today and how MedDRA can be a part of your daily activities and daily functionalities. So let me start showing responses. Okay, a lot of representation from pharmacovigilance, so welcome. A good number of coding team members, welcome to you as well. Some medical reviewers, some data analysts, and academians, and regulatory authority members. So welcome everyone. It's always good to see such a nice cross-sectional view of the industry with us. Okay, and then finally, how well do you know MedDRA? So if you're familiar with MedDRA, even if you're not a coder, if you're familiar with analysis in MedDRA or data review in MedDRA, because as we go through the session today, we'll be using some acronyms, and I just want to make sure that I'm not losing folks as we go through the session. So let's see some responses. Okay, so we do have some folks who are new to MedDRA, and so maybe as we go through the first couple of instructional slides, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about MedDRA, and when we share the browser and demo the browser, maybe we'll be a little bit more detailed in that area. Okay, so this is great. Thank you so much for your responses. So MedDRA was created by the ICH in the 1990s. In fact, if you go to the ICH website, you're going to find MedDRA listed under work products as an M1 guideline. So it's the first multidisciplinary ICH guideline. So MedDRA is an ICH standard. My team, the MedDRA MSSO or MedDRA Management and Support Services Organization, we don't own MedDRA. ICH owns MedDRA, but we do offer services in regards to MedDRA's maintenance, subscription, distribution. We offer the MSSO tools that are available to subscribers, including the web-based browser that we'll see a little bit later on. And we offer MedDRA trainings like today's session. Our activities are overseen by the MedDRA Management Committee, composed of ICH parties, MHRA, Health Canada, and WHO as observer. This is our disclaimer and copyright notice. So just like MedDRA is owned by the ICH, these slides are also owned and copyright protected to the ICH. However, you can use them with the exception of the logos, of the MedDRA and ICH logos. But if you do use them and you make any modifications or adaptations or translations, please ensure that they are clearly demarcated and avoid any inference that these changes were in any way endorsed or sponsored by the ICH. The second bullet point is the legal warranty, that the presentation is provided as is without warranty of any kind. And the third does not apply because we don't have third-party material today. So a bit of an overview of what we'll be covering. We'll be talking about why medication errors is such an important topic in the regulatory world. We'll go through some definitions, terminologies based on ICH guidance documents. We'll walk you through a few general principles for coding of medication errors and give some examples where you get a chance to test them out through the PolEV tool. And we'll wrap it up with a Q&A session at the end. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so medication errors is a very important topic in the regulatory world globally. And when you think about it, the first fundamental principle of healthcare service is to first do no harm. So nobody should be harmed receiving healthcare. However, there is compelling evidence of a huge burden of avoidable patient harm globally across the world. In fact, patient harm during healthcare is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality globally. So medication safety is an international priority. There are many publications on the impact of medication errors. WHO does a really nice job of showcasing that impact globally. So about 1 in 10 patients is harmed in healthcare. There could be more than 3 million deaths annually due to unsafe care, and about 50% of harm is preventable. And half of all avoidable harm in healthcare is related to medications. So this shows you the scope of the impact of medication errors. Additionally, preventable medication-related harm may be severe or life-threatening more often than other types of patient harm. And then you have the cost of it. So WHO had an initiative called Medication Without Harm, and they estimated that the cost associated with medication errors globally stand at about $42 billion. So that's a large cost. So when you have a problem that is prevalent, that can cause serious problems, and is preventable, it gains a lot of interest from the regulatory bodies, and that's exactly what happens. So medication errors do have a high impact on patient safety and healthcare systems on a worldwide basis. And they are the most common preventable reason for adverse events in the medication use process. And the key word here is preventable. So if you know why it happened, you can, in theory, prevent it from happening again. And that's the focus of the regulatory authorities. They do give a lot of attention to guidances, instructions, publications, documentation in support of how to record medication errors, how to report them, how to code them, how to correctly assess them and share the information about them. Because if we understand the causes or contributing factors to medication errors, we can actually make a headway into preventing them and improving the patient safety. Okay, so in response to this very important and interesting topic and the activities within the regulatory world, MedDRA also responded by expansion its database to introduce many terms that cover many different types of medication errors. There was also hierarchical restructuring to also account for search of MedDRA terms in support of medication error coding, as well as guidance documents that are ICH endorsed, which we'll talk about next. Okay, so the ICH does provide guidance documents on coding, and they are titled MedDRA Term Selection, points to consider. So why we call it MedDRA term selection? Because when you're coding in MedDRA, basically what you're doing is you are selecting a term that already exists in MedDRA at the lowest level of hierarchies. So it's called a lowest level term, and it's the most abundant. There's about just under 90,000 LLTs currently in MedDRA. And the idea is to select an LLT, or a lowest level term, that is the closest possible match to your originally reported verbatim or your natural language term. And of course, if you have multiple concepts in your report, then you select more than one LLT to cover the information that you received. So the ICH has endorsed this guideline, and it is created by a working group, which is comprised of both sides of the fence. So we have folks from the regulatory bodies and folks from industry on the working group who create and modify and update this particular guideline. So it is highly recommended to be used as the basis for any individual organization's coding conventions, because it does promote accuracy and consistency in term selection. And this does get reviewed and updated with every March release of MedDRA. So to give you an idea of the type of information the points to consider document covers, you'll see here in section 3, it does talk about medication errors, misuse, abuse, addiction, overdose toxicity terms, and off-label use. But because the topic is so important and a little bit maybe advanced or complicated, the information or the guidances in the PTC document in the points to consider is supplemented by an additional, even larger document. And the larger document, or the supplemented document, is called a companion document. And the companion document is created by the same working group, so it also includes feedback and input from regulatory bodies as well as industry members. But this is not regularly updated, so it doesn't get updated with every March release. It gets updated based on users' needs. And we are very excited that just a few weeks ago, right off the press, I think is the expression, we have a new release, release number 3, for this points to consider companion document. And just to give you an example of how detailed it goes into the topic of medication errors, it has a wide variety of specific scenarios that it touches upon, and a large number of examples. Like there's about 30 pages worth just examples of medication errors and how to code them. So it's really, really helpful. And before we move on to the next part, I just want to show you where you can find these documents. You don't need a MedDRA username or ID to access them. They're on our website. So if you go to our website, meddra.org, and it's MedDRA with 2 Ds, so meddra.org, on the top right-hand corner, you'll find the quick links. And under the PTC link, or points to consider, if you click that, it takes you to these guidance documents. So it's a large number of guidance documents are available here. The one within the blue ribbon are the ones that are ICH endorsed. So you have the MedDRA term selection. Again, so term selection is synonymous for coding in MedDRA. So there's the points to consider in different formats. There's a ICH endorsed guide also for data retrieval and presentation in MedDRA, but that's not the topic for today's session. And here is your companion document. I just wanted to show you where you can access these documents, and you're welcome to download them and refer to them as you're coding. My advice is that when you come across a specific situation, maybe look up if that scenario is referenced in these documents. Rather than read the whole document through, it might be difficult to retain a lot of information. But if you refer to these documents as you're coding, reports and verbatims that come through, it'll help you understand the thought behind why these selections were made, especially if there's more than one option of coding. So let me go back to our presentation and tackle the next part. So to get started on how to think about coding for medication errors, we need to understand definitions and how MedDRA approaches medication errors. Now, even though MedDRA stands for Medical Dictionary, for regulatory activities, it's not really a traditional dictionary. So we don't have traditional definitions in MedDRA, but we do offer something called concept descriptions. And concept descriptions are based on maybe definitions, but they're really a way for us to understand how to approach a term for purposes of term selection or coding, as well as analysis of MedDRA coded data. So for medication errors specifically, the most important part of the concept description is that they are unintentional. Nobody intended for this to happen. It wasn't intentional. If it was intentional, then it's not a medication error. So they are unintentional and they are preventable. And of course, these events can cause to either inappropriate use of the medication or patient harm. And they occur in the time period of the medication use process, which means that during the time period where the medication or the product was in the hands either of the healthcare professional, whether that person is the pharmacist, the nurse, the physician, or the patient/consumer. These events can be in different stages. So medication errors can occur from any stage of the medication use process, like a prescribing phase or the labeling or the compounding, the dispensing, the administration. And they can be related to different contributing factors, like maybe the packaging was the problem or the naming of the compound was the problem. The ETC document, or that document that we just looked at, has this really nice table on page 38. So in section 3, page 38, it has this really nice table that kind of summarizes the questions we want to ask ourselves when we're approaching a concept or a verbatim that we want to code in MedDRA that has to do with medication errors. If you are able to open that document, I'm going to show you where to find it. So let's go to the MedDRA term selection points to consider, because that table is going to be the basis of the rest of our session today. It summarizes our approach to medication error. So under the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, so we're looking at section 3, and I already cheated because I want to see which exact page it's on. And like we said, it's on page 38, but you'll see it listed as 44 because the first couple of pages are the table of contents and so on. So here's the table. If you're able to keep this open, maybe at your disposal, or refer back to it when you go back and you try to code medication errors, this is a very helpful table. So let's walk through the table and see what kind of questions it asks. In the first column, the first question we want to ask yourself is, whatever the deviation is from the product use, was it intentional? So it's either yes or no. Of course, we may or may not know, but if we do have the information, the first question is, was it intentional? If it was intentional, this deviation from the product use, then it cannot be a medication error. It can't be a medication error. Medication errors, by their description, are unintentional. So if it was intentional, then it could have been something else other than medication error. The second question we want to ask ourselves is, who caused this event, or who triggered this event? So of course, it could be the patient consumer, and it could be the healthcare professional. But if it's a misuse, abuse, or addiction, then it can only be the patient or consumer who triggered this event. And if it was an off-label use, then it can only be the healthcare professional who triggered this event. So that was the second question we ask ourselves. And then the third question we ask ourselves is, what was the intended use, or what was the context behind this event happening? Was it in the context of a therapeutic use of the product or not? Meaning, why did they take it? Did they take it for a therapeutic purpose, or did they take it for something else? Now, medication errors are always taken for therapeutic purposes. The one here that says no is either abuse or addiction, because abuse or addiction is intentional deviation from the approved use of the medication by the patient or the consumer, and it's not for a therapeutic purpose. This asterisk here under the misuse is to kind of remind us that we are trying to standardize an approach across the world, and that's not always possible. There are certain regions in the world where there is no such thing, or maybe a different definition for the concept of misuse. For the points to consider document, a misuse is described as an intentional deviation of the use of a product by a patient or a consumer, but for a therapeutic purpose. So, for example, the patient decided that they want to take an additional pill because maybe they're feeling that that will help them better. So they took the additional pill for a therapeutic purpose. And that's a misuse because they deviated from the way the doctor prescribed it or from the approved patient information. So I know we said the questions at the end, but I just want to make sure this table is clear because this will be the basis of the remainder of our session. So any questions on this table?
I am not seeing any questions in the chat at the moment.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, so let's see a few examples. So this is Lisa. Lisa's been having a rough time at work. She's under a lot of stress. And there's going to be a few different scenarios we're going to touch base on with Lisa. So starting with the first one. So Lisa's undergoing some stressful time at work. She's finding it hard to fall asleep at night, and she spoke to her doctor. So her doctor prescribed one tablet to be taken at bedtime. But yesterday she was still awake at 3 a.m. and she took a second tablet. So let's remember that scenario and go back to that table. So let's ask ourselves, when Lisa took that tablet at 3 a.m., was this an intentional decision by Lisa or accidental? We do know it was intentional. So that's the first response. So right off the bat, we know this was not a medication error. It was something else. Okay, who made the decision to deviate from what the doctor prescribed? It was Lisa herself. So this was the patient or the consumer. So right now we have a yes in this table and a patient consumer in this table. What was the purpose of Lisa taking that second tablet? Was it a therapeutic purpose or a non-therapeutic purpose? Well, Lisa took it because she couldn't sleep. It was 3 a.m. and she still wanted to be able to sleep. And that was the therapeutic indication of the tablet. So yes, it was a therapeutic use. So if we go back to Lisa and figure out the first scenario, this was an intentional misuse. Lisa intentionally made the decision to take that additional tablet, even though that's not how the doctor prescribed the medication for her. Okay, second question or second scenario. Lisa has a friend, and the friend suggested that maybe she should buy some painkillers online because painkillers have a side effect that may help calm her anxiety. So she bought the painkillers. She started with the one dose. This became 2, and now she's up to 4 doses a day. So let's go back to that table and ask ourselves, okay, did Lisa intentionally make a decision to take a medication different than the approved product information? The answer is yes, it was intentional. Who made the decision? It was Lisa herself. So the patient or the consumer made that decision. And was the intention therapeutic? So Lisa's suffering anxiety and she wants to relieve her anxiety, but she didn't take a medication specific for anxiety. She took a painkiller. She took a painkiller hoping for a different kind of effect. So this is not really a therapeutic use of that medication. So let me go back and see that second scenario. So this scenario is a drug abuse. It's not a medication error. And in MedDRA, drug abuse and substance abuse, addiction terms, they all fall under the psychiatric system organ classes. It's not a medication error. So let's see the next one. Okay, so Lisa's stressful. The doctor prescribed her sleeping tablets, but she's not tolerating them well. She's having some drowsiness and side effects. So instead, her doctor prescribed her an analgesic, but described it as an off-label use to help with her anxiety. So the medication is not specific for anxiety. It is an analgesic, but the doctor prescribed it to her as off-label use. So going back to that table. So again, was this an intentional deviation of the authorized product information? The answer is yes, this was intentional. But who made the decision, or who triggered this deviation? It was actually the physician in this case. So we are looking at the bottom of the screen. It was intentional, it was by the physician, but it was for a therapeutic purpose because it was by the physician. So that's the difference here, is that even though the medication is not specifically used for anxiety, the physician decided to prescribe that medication for anxiety, even though it was a different type or class of medication, as specifically off-label use. So it satisfied the 3 criteria, and this becomes an off-label use scenario. So let me go back to Lisa and show that this was indeed an off-label use. So what's the 4th scenario? In the 4th scenario, Lisa is stressed. She's having trouble remembering things. So she was prescribed 1 pill a day, but she forgot that she already took her pill and took it a second time. So she forgot that she had already taken a pill and she took it a second time. So let's go back to our cheat sheet here and ask ourselves, was this intentional? Did Lisa intentionally take a second pill? The answer is no. She forgot that she took the first one. She forgot about it. So her deviation from the way the doctor prescribed the medication was not intentional. She simply forgot. So this was unintentional right here in the table. And who made the decision to deviate from the approved product information? It was Lisa. So it was the patient or the consumer, but was it for a therapeutic purpose? And the answer is yes. So she did take the second pill for its therapeutic indication, but she forgot that she had already taken it. So this does constitute a medication error. So back to Lisa and back to the last scenario. So I hope this kind of walkthrough for that table is clear. And we're going to keep doing this over and over this session so that you get the hang of asking yourself these questions as you're reviewing the reports coming in. So let's look at it this time in a flowchart display. So the first questions we were asking ourselves is this deviation from the approved product use, was it intentional or not? The second question is, who made the decision to deviate from the approved product use? Was it a healthcare professional? If the answer is yes, then you're likely looking at a scenario of off-label use as long as the verbatim specifies this is off-label use. And this is an important topic and one that we have many questions come back on for off-label use. Yes, there are 3 criteria to be met for off-label use. One is that it is intentional deviation from the authorized product information. It was done or triggered by a healthcare professional, and it was in the context of therapeutic use. So these 3 criteria were met. However, the points to consider working group that includes representatives from both the industry as well as regulatory bodies have agreed that the only time in MedDRA you can select terms from MedDRA that are specific to off-label use is when the verbatim itself calls it out explicitly. So even if I have the 3 conditions met and my report doesn't say that the physician did this as an off-label use, I won't be able to assign the code for off-label use. And a lot of folks always come back to question this. So off-label use is a very sensitive topic in the regulatory body. Labels differ between different countries. Authorized use also differs between different countries. And if you want to assign a scenario as an off-label use, you need to be very careful that you can support it with your source data, because it has a lot of roll-down effect and interest by not just the regulator, also the manufacturer, also the other members of the industry. So please avoid using the preferred term off-label use and its subsumed lowest level terms unless the verbatim specifically calls out that this was off-label use. Otherwise, you're making an inference or assumption that your source data does not support. Of course, you can always send a query out if you can and clarify with the reporter to see if you suspect something sounds like off-label use, but doesn't have off-label use in the verbatim. You can always send a query out to the reporter and see if you can get them to confirm that this was indeed off-label use, so you can use that preferred term. Okay, so moving on with the flowchart. So let's say it was an intentional deviation from the approved product use, but this time it was by the consumer slash patient. The third question, was it for a therapeutic intention? So if yes, if the patient themselves deviated from the way the medication was prescribed, but because they wanted to seek out a therapeutic relief of that medication, then this is a misuse. They're using it differently than what the doctor prescribed, but they're using it for its therapeutic purposes, and they did it intentionally. Of course, if the answer is no, it was not for a therapeutic indication, that's when we start thinking about maybe this is drug abuse, maybe this is drug dependence, and maybe even addiction later on. If the intentionality is not there, so this wasn't intended to happen, they deviated from the authorized product information, but this was not intentional, it was in fact accidental, then the second question is by whom? And it could be either a healthcare professional or the patient, but of course it was for therapeutic intention, and those are the criteria to be met for a medication error. So this is a nice flow to show the same table that we just shared on the PTC document. Of course, in real world, the reports don't always have answers to all these questions. So the reporter will most likely give you information that is missing or incomplete, and sometimes you don't even know the answer to the first question, the intentionality. So even then, you can't really tell whether the event happened by intention or by accident. So if the report comes in and says for the past month, she's been taking an extra tablet at bedtime, this report is not telling me why she's been taking an extra tablet at bedtime. Maybe she didn't really understand the instructions, or maybe the doctor made a mistake giving her a wrong schedule for this medication. Maybe she took it on her own because her symptoms are the worst at night, or maybe the doctor believed this is more effective than the authorized use of the medication and is doing it as an off-label approach. So we don't have full information in all reports, and that's why MedDRA does account for reports that come in where there is not a lot of details to answer all the questions that we talked about. And in this case, MedDRA offers these quote unquote neutral preferred terms. So neutral preferred terms will give you the option to code a report as is if you don't have answers to some of the questions we posed. So in the very first question, when we said, is this deviation from the approved product information intentional or is it not intentional? If we're not sure if the event was accidental or not, then we have the option to select the product use issue. So it's an issue in the use of the product, but we're not sure if this issue was intentional or accidental. And of course, it has different subsumed lowest level terms within it. And if we're not even sure if the intentional use, so if we know that it was intentional, but we don't know if it was for therapeutic purposes or not, then we have an intentional product use issue. Okay, so now that we know that there are scenarios where the information is incomplete, if we go back to our flow chart, we can now plug in the scenarios where this information is incomplete, seeing the question marks. So if it's intentional, but we don't know the therapeutic intention, we have the option of intentional product use issue rather than the misuse. And if we don't even know the first response, whether it's intentional or accidental, we have the option of the preferred term product use issue. Now, those two PTs are not the only neutral PTs in MedDRA. So we have a host of different neutral PTs, preferred terms in MedDRA. So if the patient received an extra dose, but we don't know why they received that extra dose, we have preferred term in MedDRA available to code that. If they deviated from the schedule of product administration, but we don't know why, we have a preferred term for that, and so on and so forth. So for incorrect dosage, incorrect dose, and of course, dose and dosage are not synonymous for purposes of MedDRA term selection. The dose is the amount of drug you give in one at the one time, but the dosage is more extensive than that. So it talks about the different doses, the different sizes, the frequencies, etc. Okay, and of course there are different options in MedDRA, even talking about the population or age group of the recipient and whether or not there was an interruption for the administration, whether there was a dose omission, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's now do a bit of a demo within the browser to kind of walk us through where we can find these different preferred terms and these different LLTs. In the panel of your GoToWebinar, on the bottom towards your chat feature, there are temporary credentials that will allow you to access the W-based browser, the web-based browser, the WBB. These credentials are available to you through the end of the week. So if you don't have access to your own organizational MedDRA login and password, please feel free to use them. You can also, if you are able to, log in to the WBB as we are going through the session. It will be really helpful for you to test it out on your end to see how we're looking for these terms on medication errors. And if you have any questions about accessing the WBB, please do reach out to Hannah. She'll be very happy to help you. So the first question is, where do I find this WBB? So let me go back to our website. So this is meddra.org. Again, to the quick links on the top. So the WBB, or the web-based browser, has its own quick link on the top right-hand corner. And if we click that, it will take us to a login page. And this is where you're going to put in your temporary credentials that are available to you in the GoToWebinar panel, the chat panel. So let's log in. And because we have a few folks on the line that are not very familiar with MedDRA or new to MedDRA, I just want to give you a short overview of how we find terms in MedDRA. So there are two ways to look up or to search for terms within MedDRA. We said that coding in MedDRA is basically finding a term that already exists in MedDRA that is the closest possible match to the verbatim you're trying to code. And some organizations have a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that for each reported verbatim, there needs to be only one MedDRA LLT or MedDRA lowest level term, because that's the term that you use when you're coding. Or some organizations will tell you that code everything that comes in, so every bit of information, and that is the preferred option. You code every bit of information that comes in. And if you do code every bit of information that comes in, some organizations allow that for the same field or the same report, and some organizations will split that into different entries. So that's all up to your organization. But the idea here is, where do we find these terms? So let's say you're looking for the patient being given the wrong dose, and you're not even sure where to start looking for the wrong dose. You can simply try typing it in. So you can do, well, let me do dose first. So you can put in dose and just search MedDRA. And MedDRA will tell you how many terms it found. So it's found a total of 154 terms within the hierarchy of MedDRA. And at the LLT level, which is the one we use for coding, there's 118. So maybe that's a little bit too much. So you want to narrow it down, and you want to specify maybe a specific something with this dose. Maybe it was the wrong dose. So if we put the wrong dose and we click search, now we have a much shorter list of possible options. So the LLTs in this case are only 3. So I have an exact match for wrong dose. I have a term that says potential for medication error, wrong dose, and I have one that says wrong dose administered. So this is the lowest level term in MedDRA. The LLTs are the level in MedDRA where we actually code to. But LLTs, they route to a higher term, which is called a preferred term, a PT. And if I expand the plus signs from the LLT, it takes me to whichever PT it's linked to, and every LLT is linked to only one PT. So what's the difference between wrong dose and wrong dose administered? If I expand it and take a look, the wrong dose doesn't give me anything else other than the same preferred term. So the same preferred term at the preferred term level is also wrong dose. But the wrong dose administered is taking me to a preferred term that says incorrect dose administered. If I expand again, I see something called an HLT, a high level term. So now we're starting to group ourselves together. So LLTs that are siblings or maybe convey a similar concept are grouped together under the same preferred term. Preferred terms that are similar are grouped together under the same high level term. High level terms that are similar are grouped together under high level group terms, and they get smaller and smaller in number until we get to the highest level in the hierarchy, which is a system organ class. So there's only 5 levels of hierarchy in MedDRA. And the system organ class are the smallest in number. There's only 27 of them. The LLTs are the highest in number. Like we said, there's about 90,000 of them. So the wrong dose goes to the injury system organ class, and the wrong dose administered also goes to the injury system organ class. So they are being grouped together in that system organ class. But when we pay attention to the differences, the difference is the high level term. The wrong dose goes to medication errors, product use errors, and issues not elsewhere classified. So they're not really specific as to how the wrong dose happened. The wrong dose administered goes to an high-level term of product administration errors and issues. It tells me the stage where this happened, because the verbatim itself or the LLT itself is telling me the wrong dose was in fact administered. So there was a product administration error. The patient ended up taking this. With the wrong dose, I'm not even sure that the patient actually took it. So that's the difference between them. So that's a bottom up. I put in whatever words I can find or roots of words or combination of words that I'm hoping to give me a good match to my verbatim. And that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is go from the top down. So I already know, looking at this hierarchy, that the system organ class I'm interested in is the injury, poisoning, and procedural complication, right? So let me look for this system organ class. So here are my 27 system organ classes. And again, if I click on the plus sign, I'm going to expand that particular system organ class, but this time from the top down. So let's start with the injury system organ class and just expand it. So I see there's a collection of HLGTs, high-level group terms. This collection of HLGTs is grouping similar concepts together and kind of giving me an idea of where to start looking. Am I looking for an administration site reaction? No, I'm looking for medication errors. So I'm not looking for injuries, not looking for exposures or poisoning. I'm looking for medication errors. So I start seeing them here. So here's my HLGT for medication errors and other product use errors and issues. Here's my off-label use and intentional product misuses or intentional product use issues. Here's my overdose and underdose. If I expand my medication errors, now I'm finding my high-level terms. So again, it's telling me, do you know what stage of medication error you're interested in? Because I can help you narrow your search. Are you interested in administration errors? You know that the patient took the medication. Was this a dispensing error? Was it because during the dispensing phase? Was it a prescribing error? Was it during the prescribing phase? So let's take a look, for example, at the dispensing errors. So was this a drug dispensed to the wrong patient? Was this a product dispensing error or a product dispensing issue? So when we have error and issue, that means that there's a bit of information I'm missing with the issue. I'm not sure it was an error. So going back to that table, that cheat sheet, when I asked myself the questions, was it intentional or not? If I couldn't even start to answer and say it was unintentional, if I can't confirm it, then I'm not sure it was an error. So this is called a neutral term. Just like we said, MedDRA has a lot of neutral terms. And of course, if you expand the preferred term, you're going to see all these different lowest level terms, or LLTs, that you can select the one that is closest to your verbatim. So if you select, for example, the drug was not dispensed in the original container because you have that level of details in your verbatim, then you have something similar in MedDRA that you can code to. But the preferred term level, this level in MedDRA, this is the one that is usually used for data displays, data reporting, data analysis, data retrieval, and submission. So it's very important level, the PT level. The LLT level is subsumed under the PT, but it is the level that is used for coding because it is the most numerous, trying to give you as many different options to be as close as possible to the original verbatim. So I hope this kind of overview was helpful. Let's take a look, for example, at overdose and underdose. For overdoses, we have the option in MedDRA to code to intentional overdose if the verbatim supports that, or standalone overdose if I don't have that information, or a prescribed overdose if my verbatim supports that. So, but what is overdose? So this brings me to another good resource for you when you are approaching reports that come in from medication error. Up here on the top ribbon is MedDRA concept descriptions. So if you remember, we already talked about how MedDRA defines or describes medication errors. Let's see if there are other types of medication errors or misuse or abuse within these concept descriptions. If I click on them, it's going to open a window and it's alphabetized. And it's not really that big. So it's the kind of document that's not, it can't possibly cover every single term or concept in MedDRA, but it will give you a nice idea about different concepts that may be a little bit challenging to agree to or to have a consensus about. So it will tell you, for the purposes of coding in MedDRA, this is how MedDRA approaches this particular term. So for example, abuse is here, and it says for the purposes of term selection in MedDRA, abuse is intentional. So remember that cheat sheet, that tracker, the cheat sheet tracker that we looked at. The first question was, is this intentional or unintentional? And abuse is always intentional. Abuse is always non-therapeutic. And of course, it's by the patient or the consumer. And it's really the purpose of abuse is non-therapeutic, so it's a perceived reward. It's a desired effect. It could be just to get high from the product, if the product can cause that. So we were talking about overdose. So let's go with the O. So here's my O. If I click on O, I see all the different concepts here with an O, and here's my overdose. So it says, for the purposes of coding in MedDRA, an overdose is more than the maximum recommended dose. So just the patient taking a bit of extra tablets doesn't mean that it's an overdose unless I know that this was really excessive and over the maximum recommended dose. And it kind of makes sense that underdose will follow the same principle. So underdose, again, for the purposes of coding in MedDRA, underdose is when the administration is less than the minimum recommended dose, whether this is in quantity or in concentration. Okay, so I think this product concept descriptions is really helpful when you do come across scenarios that you're trying to code. Take a look in concept descriptions. Is the concept description there? It will give you a good idea of how this is approached in MedDRA. Okay, so let me go back to my slides. So we talked about concept descriptions, where to find them, what kind of information they give you. We talked about the hierarchy and how the top-down search in the injury system organ class will help you find areas of interest, specifically the medication errors, the off-label uses, and the overdoses. So later on, when we get to the hands-on examples, you can actually go to the HLGT for medication errors if the scenario fulfills the criteria of a medication error. Try to find the high-level term that is a good starting point for you to start looking for the possible best options in coding. And we also said that the substance related addictive disorders or abuse, they fall under the psychiatric disorders. They are not medication errors in MedDRA. Okay, so just to kind of summarize what the high-level group term in MedDRA offers, it offers terms for type of error. So things like wrong drug, wrong dose, wrong route, when you don't know the phase or the stage that it happened in. This verbatim is not telling me whether or not the patient was administered the wrong dose or administered the wrong route or administered the wrong drug. I just know that there was a wrong drug in the report, so I have a term for that in MedDRA. If I do know the specific stage or phase of the error during the medication use process, I can select one that matches it because the HLGT has different high-level terms related to the different stages. So I do have prescribing errors, administration errors, dispensing errors, and so on. MedDRA also is robust enough to give me terms that has more than one piece of information. So if I know the stage, I know this was a prescribing error, and I know the type, I know that there was a wrong drug prescribed, is it possible to find in MedDRA one term that gives me both bits of information? If yes, then that's the better option for me to code to rather than separating them out. So in this particular example, a wrong drug was prescribed. So in MedDRA, I do have an LLT for wrong drug prescribed, and that goes to the product prescribing error. So that would be a better option for me than to say there was a wrong drug and then there was a drug prescription error. Rather than split them, I can have one term in MedDRA that gives me both bits of information. Same for wrong drug administered. That goes to the preferred term of wrong product administered. And I want you to pay attention here because I found this interesting, that the preferred term for when it's prescribing does not have the wrong product in the preferred term. It just tells you that there was a prescription error. But when the wrong drug was actually administered to the patient, that is such an important bit of information that the preferred term level included that. There was a wrong product administered. So in your administration error high-level term, you might find terms within there that carry multiple bits of information, because if the medication that is used in deviation from the authorized product information actually made it to the patient and the patient took it, that is a very important bit of information to capture. So there are options for multiple bits of information in the same preferred term under the administration errors. And if you're curious, after our call, you can open up that HLT and take a look at the different options and see if you find more. So other options that are available in the high-level grouping term of medication errors in MedDRA are scenarios where a medication error did not even occur. So there was no medication error, but there was a circumstance that could have led to a medication error. And those are very important to capture. And the reason why it's very important for the regulatory bodies to capture those is to prevent them from happening, especially if you can identify why they happened. So if you have the contributing factor or the underlying cause of why this could have led to a medication error, you do need to capture that in your coding so that there are mitigation steps that can be implemented to prevent it from happening. Other scenarios are intercepted errors. Intercepted errors means that an error did occur, but the patient never ended up taking that drug. So somewhere along the medication use process, an error did occur, but if it never reached the patient and the patient never took that medication in that deviation, then that's an intercepted error. So there are options for intercepted errors within that HLGT. And there are situations, like we said, that are neutral, when we can't really answer the question, was this intentional or not, that allows us to select LLTs and PTs that are neutral. Okay, so here's an example question. If anybody needs access to the poll EV, please let us know. I do believe that we have in the chat feature, I do think we have the login, but if not, I'm happy to show the QR code again. But here's a question. So let's see if we can approach this, and let's see what you guys think about this. So the dose taken was below the minimum recommended dose according to the product label. How would you code this? So let's think about this for a minute and see, do we have any concept descriptions in MedDRA that talk about when a dose is below the minimum recommended dose? I'm going to give you time to answer because I want to see the majority of the responses. The dose taken was below the minimum recommended dose according to the product label. How would we code this? Okay, so let me take a look at responses now. And the majority have selected underdose, and I do agree with you. So a couple of things to think about. Let's go back to the concept descriptions. What is underdose? How is underdose described for purposes of MedDRA? So underdose says, for the purposes of MedDRA selection, underdose is when the administration of a product is less than the minimum recommended dose. So even if the report tells me they took a dose that's less than what they were prescribed, that doesn't mean it was an underdose unless the report tells me this was less than the minimum recommended dose. So let's go back to the other options. So there was a drug administration error. I do agree with this one. And this is where your organization-specific guidelines come in to see, do you want to capture this as a second LLT as well? Because this dose actually was taken. And for the folks who did not select accidental underdose, I'm very happy to see that because the verbatim itself does not answer the question as to whether or not this was done intentionally. So I can't say this was accidental. I just know that the dose was taken and it was below the minimum recommended dose. Of course, it is an incorrect dose is administered. That's not incorrect, but the underdose is more specific. And it matches the verbatim as we received it because the verbatim itself spelled out that this was below the minimum recommended dose. Okay, let's see the next one. Inadvertently took excessive dose of the prescribed pills. So if someone inadvertently took excessive dose of their prescribed pills, how would we code this? What kind of concept are we looking at? So let's see if we can start asking ourselves the questions from the beginning. Was this intentional or not intentional? Do we know in the reported verbatim? So I'm just going to give it time. And again, as a reminder, the tool is anonymized. You have the QR code on the screen. So let me just enlarge that a little bit. If you do want to log in and give it a shot. And the responses are anonymized. So we're not going to know who answered what. Okay, so just maybe a couple more responses coming in, but let's see the responses now in interest of time, and let's see what folks decided. All right, so the majority have selected accidental overdose. So let's go to our concept descriptions and see what is an overdose. So pick an O, and we look at overdose. So for the purposes of coding in MedDRA, an overdose is more than the maximum recommended dose, i.e. excessive. So MedDRA will accept terminology that says excessive dose as an overdose, or if they spell out that it's more than the maximum recommended dose. So going back to our verbatim said, inadvertently took excessive dose of the prescribed pills. So I do know that this was an overdose. And I have the word inadvertently in my verbatim. So inadvertently means they did not mean to. So I do know this was accidental. So thank you for those who selected accidental overdose. You are all correct. All right. So general principles for coding medication errors. It's the same as approaching any coding, really, in MedDRA. You want to have the best quality possible of the data coming in. If you don't have a good quality of data coming in, you want to be able to maybe clarify or request more information from the reporter if possible. Once you have the clarification or the data as highest quality as possible, you want to select lowest level terms in MedDRA that are the closest possible match to your original verbatim, to your natural language term as you received it from the reporter. And you want to code what you received. You don't want to add information when you're coding, and you don't want to omit information when you're coding. And that's where we might introduce the option of selecting more than one lowest level term or LLT in MedDRA to cover every bit of information, every bit of detail that's coming in the report. And of course, we only want to use current LLTs. So for those of you familiar with MedDRA, non-currency only occurs at the LLT level. Non-current LLTs are maintained in MedDRA for historical purposes. So we don't take terms out of MedDRA even if they become non-current. But when we're coding, we only use current LLTs in MedDRA. Okay, so tips for coding medication errors, things to kind of keep in the back of our heads. We have sources available to us. We have concept descriptions right there on the tool that might give us a hint whether this term satisfies a certain concept description or not. We have our points to consider, ICH endorsed guideline that we talked about. We have that extensive document that's called the companion document. It's over 100 pages long. It has a lot of details in it about medication errors. These are all tools available to us. The hierarchy of MedDRA is also set up in a way that helps us decide where we want to look for terms when we're selecting coding in MedDRA, especially in the system organ class, injury, poisoning, and procedural complications. So the injury SOC is where we're going to find our medication errors, our overdoses, our off-label uses. Once we think that we found a nice matching LLT, please follow the hierarchy of the LLT. Please make sure that if you're looking from the bottom up, please make sure that you're following the right hierarchy and that the LLT is not taking you, for example, into the surgical system organ class or the general system organ class or somewhere else that you don't want to go. And next is you also have the option to browse MedDRA top-down. In fact, it is recommended that you browse it top-down when you're approaching coding for medication errors because there are so many different nuances within the LLT selections that are trying to cover as many different scenarios as possible in a standardized fashion, which is really difficult to do because reports come in from the reporters in so many different ways of saying what happened that it's hard to find the LLT sometimes. It may not have the words as you see them in the original report, but it covers the scenario as you received it. So the top-down approach may take you a bit of time to get familiar with it, but once you use it a couple of times, then you'll know which HLT, which high-level term, grouping term you want to start with when you're looking for a specific code in MedDRA. And the last tip is that MedDRA does have LLTs and PTs that may say drug in them or may say device in them or may say vaccine in them. But if you don't find one that is specific to the product, look for one that has product in them. Because let's take another look at concept descriptions. What is product for the purposes of coding in MedDRA? So here's product. So in context of MedDRA coding, the word product can refer to many different types of products, whether they are drugs, biologics, vaccines, combination products, devices, etc. So if you find a good match for the scenario you're looking at, but you don't find it that it says drug, look for that scenario where it says product and you can still use it. Okay, we're going to go over, so the next section is going to be principles for coding medical medication errors. And then after we finish these principles, we're going to test a few examples hands-on. So Hannah, maybe I can stop here 2 minutes and ask, are there questions?
Yes, we've just got a couple questions. We have one that says, use an unapproved age group. Can that be coded as off-label?
So if it is an unapproved age group, right, how do we know that it was intentionally given as off-label use? I mean, you can argue that scenario, and it's a good question because it is sometimes confusing when you look at all of these unapproved terms within MedDRA. You have unapproved for different scenarios within MedDRA, but when you want to select off-label specifically, the verbatim must say off-label. Otherwise, you're making an inference, you're making an assumption that this was intentionally used as off-label. So even if a mom gives her son maybe half her tablet, thinking that by cutting it in half, it's going to help him because she doesn't want to go get a different prescription for her child. This is an unapproved for that age group. But how do we know that it was the mom who did it by breaking the tablet in half, or was it the physician who intentionally decided to give this young patient a medication not yet approved in that country for that particular age group for therapeutic purposes? So even if the selection says unapproved, that does not equate to off-label unless your report specifically calls that out. But thank you for the question.
Great. Well, we have just one more question at the moment. They say a patient is using a minoxidil spray for alopecia, but the spray cap of the bottle broke. And so they can no longer properly regulate the amount of product applied. So they're kind of eyeballing and doing amounts of half a teaspoon instead of the spray amount. Would that be considered an incorrect dose administered or more of a product issue?
That's a large amount of data in that verbatim that they submitted. So, we can't really go through here and break it down, but you have a large amount of information that you just gave me, right? There was an issue with the packaging. I don't know why it broke. If your report tells you specifically it was flimsy material, so is there a quality issue here or not is also maybe something you want to look at. So you do have kind of a series of bits of information that you received. It may not always be possible to choose one single LLT that covers everything. So when you're deconstructing a report that comes in, you're going to be asking yourself different questions. Was there a medication error that happened? Right? Was there anything unintentional in this scenario that happened that I can put my hand on and say this was a medication error? Was there a device component in this medication use process? And if there was a device component, we're going to be talking about it. As you see, principle number 8 talks about a drug delivery device. So maybe this will help also guide our thought process. But also, did the patient receive an incomplete dose? I mean, the report that you just gave has a lot of details about a thing that happened, and I'm sorry I don't remember all of it, but it's a good way to start thinking about it. Was there a medication error? Was there an issue with the device? Was there a device? Was there an issue with the device? Was there maybe a device use problem? Was there a device quality problem? And then when we're talking about the dosage, was the dosage impacted by the device? And did the patient receive an incorrect dose at the end of it? So a lot of questions you want to ask yourself. And if you find yourself answering yes to any of these, that there's a bit of information that you have in that report, please make sure you don't lose it in MedDRA. So in this kind of scenario, you're going to be assigning multiple LLTs to one report to capture all the information coming in. But we are going to be talking or touching base about similar kind of situations as we go through. So take a look at what we present, and please follow up with us if you have additional questions. So these 8 principles, we're going to be talking about them in detail. So I'm not going to stop at this slide and name them out, because we're going to be addressing them one by one. So let's start with the question of, well, MedDRA has a PT that's just medication error. When do we use this? And it was interesting, we had a user group meeting in the US last year in June, and we had a presenter who's a member of the FDA, and she was very passionate about this. She presented a large number of examples talking about how useless the PT medication error is when it comes to analysis. Because yes, it's good to know that a medication error happened, but if you don't give us the details of what type of error happened, why it happened, was there a clinical sequelae to the patient that this happened, was there maybe an originating error and then another error that followed that happens, you're not giving a lot of detail when you're just coding to medication error. So the recommendation, the PTC guidance document, is we should avoid using just a plain basic code of medication error unless that's the only information we have coming in from the reporter. And just like we showed in our high-level grouping term of medication errors, there's a plethora of terms that you can look at and evaluate and assess and see if they match your scenario. So your last resort should be the LLT medication error, not a first option. However, if your report comes in and there is a specific type of error in your report and you've exhausted your search in MedDRA and couldn't find anything that captures that, you can always submit a change request to the MSSO and request a new term to be added to MedDRA, and all the change requests are reviewed by our International Medical Officers team. So here's an example. So this patient inadvertently didn't use the medication as prescribed. So the report itself tells us that this was inadvertent, so it was not intentional. So right off the bat, I'm answering that their intentionality wasn't there. And we know that there was a deviation from the authorized product information or the approved use of the medication, but we don't have any other information. And the report already tells us, don't bother querying us. There's no further information available. In this kind of scenario, yes, we can select the LLT of medication error because all we know is that it was an error because it was inadvertent deviation from the approved use of the medication. But there's nothing else that we have from the reporter. The second concept that we're going to be talking about for coding is, when do we split code? So just like that user, thank you for that question, asked us about when you have a scenario that gives you a lot of information, how are you approaching this? Well, that's when split coding comes in. And when we say split coding, what we mean is you're selecting more than one lowest level term or LLT in MedDRA to capture the entirety of the story that you're looking at in your report. So for example, sometimes we have an originating error or an initial error that happened, and this was followed by a consequent or additional error, and this was caused by a contributing factor, and we may even have a clinical sequelae that happened to the patient. So that's a big story, and you want to make sure that you don't omit any of the parts of this story when you're converting that into MedDRA codes. So in this particular scenario, for example, the physician prescribed the wrong medication. So the pharmacist dispensed the wrong medication and the patient ended up taking the wrong medication. There are 3 errors in this kind of example. There's an originating error where the physician prescribed the wrong one, and there's consequent errors where the pharmacist dispensed the wrong one and the patient actually consumed or took the wrong medication. However, there is a note here that we want to avoid double coding. So if you are looking at, for example, that term that we talked about, the wrong drug dispensed. So if your reporter tells you that there was a wrong drug that was dispensed by the pharmacist, and you didn't realize that MedDRA has an LLT for wrong drug dispensed, and you ended up coding it to a drug dispensing error and a wrong drug, then you selected 2 codes instead of 1, then you're double coding. Sometimes you can't help it because you have to introduce multiple LLTs to capture the entire story, but please pay attention that MedDRA does have terms that carry multiple bits of information within the same term, especially at the lowest level term, the LLT level. So be thorough in your research of MedDRA when you look at the hierarchy of MedDRA to make sure that there is no concept already in there that captures the multiple bits of information that you have in your report. Okay, so here's an example that the nurse miscalculated a dose and the patient received 40 milligram instead of 20 milligram of his medication and he experienced severe hypertension. So how many bits of information am I receiving in this report? I know there was a miscalculation of the dose, so there was an unintentional deviation from the approved product use here. Yes, there was an unintentional deviation. The nurse miscalculated the dose, so there was a medication error. We know that the patient actually received this wrong dose, and we know that the patient developed clinical sequelae. So when I'm thinking about how I can convert this into MedDRA codes, how many do I need? I need to capture the dose calculation error. I need to capture that the dose administered was increased. So there was an incorrect dose that was administered at an increased rate than approved. And I also want to capture the clinical sequelae for the patients, their hypertension. So there's multiple bits of information. I can't capture everything in one term in MedDRA. This is an example where I have to split code and introduce multiple LLTs. Principle 3 talks about the off-label use that we talked about before. So for the off-label use, the working group of the PTC guideline is very clear on their stance. The off-label terms should only be selected in MedDRA when off-label is specifically mentioned in the verbatim. They even added an update to the most recent March release of the PTC guideline to reinforce this point and say that even if the information you receive is suggestive of off-label, but the off-label is not specifically reported, in that case, the best option is to attempt to obtain clarification. And if there's no further clarification possible, please don't infer the off-label use occurred. So even in scenarios where you're thinking, gosh, this really looks like as though it was off-label, but it doesn't have off-label specifically called out, you don't code it to off-label in MedDRA, and that's according to the PTC guidelines. Okay, so the next principle, there's an example of this principle. So the pediatrician decided to use COVID-19 vaccine off-label for a 10-year-old high-risk patient. But this vaccine was not yet approved in that particular country for this age group. So this is an example of an unapproved age group, but the example itself or the report itself or the verbatim itself specifically tells me the physician made this decision as off-label to give his high-risk patient this vaccine for therapeutic purposes. So in this particular instance, I can search under the off-label preferred term and see if I can find an LLT that best matches the scenario of an off-label use in an unapproved age group. But if I didn't have off-label in my reported verbatim, I cannot use the PT of off-label use. Okay, principle 4. Potential medication errors. So there are scenarios, there are reports that come in and say a medication error didn't occur, but we noticed this, or but we saw that, or but there was an issue with this, or but there was an issue with that could have led to a medication error. And these do exist in that HLGT, like we said, in MedDRA for medication errors, even though they didn't occur, because it's very important to capture these. So MedDRA has the PT for circumstance or information capable of leading to medication error or leading to device use error, and the type of potential error may actually be included in some of the LLTs. So let's see an example of what I'm talking about. So when we go to, and let's break it down again. So I started with my injury SOC. This is my system organ class for injury SOC. Here's my medication errors and other product use errors and issues. Because the examples I'm looking for didn't actually occur, so I'm looking for not elsewhere classified. So under medication errors or product use errors and issues, not elsewhere classified, I'm going to find my circumstances, PTs. And when I expand my circumstances or information capable of leading to a medication error, preferred term, I'm going to see a group of LLTs that I can look at and see, does my report specify what type of potential error this could have led to? So for example, if my report is telling me that there was an ambiguity in the dosage information or in the dose information, and we could have ended up giving the patient the wrong dose. So it didn't happen, but it could have happened because of this. Do I have an LLT that talks about the specific type of potential error? I do have them on the bottom here. The wrong dose, the wrong drug, the wrong route. They are included in my LLTs. Not every possible type of error is included. So, for example, the wrong strength is not in here. So if somebody comes and says, well, this could have led to a wrong strength being compounded for that medication, then that's when I want to consider capturing the wrong strength as a separate LLT and keeping the PT of circumstance or information capable of leading to a medication error. Okay, so for potential medication errors, like we said, they're important to capture as the circumstance PTs. Try to look for an LLT that is the closest match to whatever your report includes, especially if it has a type of potential error. And then think about whether or not the report gave you why this happened. I mean, it says something happened. So in these kind of potential errors, usually there's a contributing factor. So for example, the labels looked alike, and that was the issue here. So just as a reminder, when you have potential errors, look for LLTs that provide the type of errors and look for contributing factors in your report. If you find them, pick an LLT or PT in MedDRA that best matches that contributing factor or factors. So here's an example. So the pharmacist submitted a report that said the print on the drug label was blurred. Because of that blurring, this could lead to the wrong dose being administered by mistake. So when you ask yourself, is this a medication error? Well, there was no error. There was no actual deviation from the product use. Nothing happened as an event. But the pharmacist was very diligent and noticed that the blurred print on the drug label could lead to the wrong dose being administered. So yes, remember that in this particular situation, there is a potential error here. So I need to make sure that I capture this potential error and look for LLTs that have the specific type of that potential error. In this particular case, is the possibility of a wrong dose being administered. I do have an LLT in MedDRA for potential for medication error, wrong dose. So I have that level of granularity. That goes to the PT of circumstance or information capable of leading to medication error. Do I have a contributing factor in this particular report? And like we said, usually potential errors do inform you of what the contributing factor was. And in this case, yes, I do have a contributing factor. So there was an issue with the label that made the text on it illegible. They couldn't read it clearly because of the blurred print, and that goes to the product label issue. Okay. The next concept is intercepted medication errors. An intercepted medication error means that an error did in fact occur. However, it was intercepted. And intercepted means it was stopped before it reached its destination, and its destination was the patient. So an intercepted medication error is a medication error that has occurred but prevented from reaching the patient or the consumer. And when we are trying to find LLTs in MedDRA that best match the scenario, we need to think about what stage the actual error occurred, not what stage it was stopped or intercepted. So, for example, if the physician prescribed a wrong medication, but the pharmacist noticed that, so the pharmacist stopped it from being dispensed, the error that occurred was the prescription phase. There was an error during the prescription phase, but it was stopped by the pharmacist. If I want to search for the best suiting LLT in this case, I want to think about the stage where the error occurred. And in this case, it was a prescription error, but I know that it was intercepted. So this was an intercepted prescription error. So here's an example. The pharmacist made an error when she was dispensing the drug. The nurse noticed, identified that this was an error, did not give it to the patient. So the report is telling me there was an error that happened. There was a medication error. It's telling me what phase or what stage during the medication use process that this error occurred, and it was the dispensing phase or the dispensing stage. So I know that a dispensing error occurred. I also know that it was intercepted because the nurse noticed, she didn't give it to the patient. So there was an interception in this story. But what are the LLTs that I'm interested in? I'm interested in LLT that has the fact that it was intercepted in the stage that it occurred. So it occurred in the dispensing stage because the pharmacist is the one who made the error in this story. So the best matching LLT is an intercepted drug dispensing error. Okay, and that goes to the PT, intercepted product dispensing error. Okay, any questions on this one, Hannah?
We have just one question in the chat saying, unintentional use by patient for non-therapeutic use. What category does this belong to?
So it was unintentional and it was non-therapeutic. So I think you're asking about, right? These scenarios where it was intentional, no, and therapeutic, no, which is not listed on this table, but thank you for the question. So what kind of scenarios would we think about where somebody took a medication by accident and they were not meaning to take it for therapeutic purposes? So you might be thinking of something where the wife took the pill thinking it's hers, but it ended up being her husband's medication, or a child took a medication thinking it was candy, right? So in those kind of scenarios, you're really thinking about exposure. There was unintentional exposure. So let me take you to that HLGT. So here we are at the injury system organ class. Here we are at the HLGT of medication errors and other product use errors and issues, the same HLGT. When you expand it, well, let me just do it where it doesn't expand where I was before. When you expand it, you have all these different HLTs that talk about the stages of the medication, but you have that first HLT at the top that gives you the options for accidental exposure to the product. So if we pick one, accidental exposure to the product, and just expand that preferred term, it will give you a few examples. So for example, the nurse was accidentally exposed while she was administering the drug. So something splashed on her, or something pricked her and she was accidentally exposed. So this was unintentional. It could either be the patient or consumer themselves or a healthcare professional, and it was not a therapeutic purpose. So you might want to consider looking in the accidental exposure to product, and some of them have a bit more detail within that HLT. For example, if the a person exposed was a child, it's listed at the preferred term, or an elderly person. Even though in MedDRA usually demographic information is not included, but these types of exposures, because they are significant when it comes to the population and the age grouping, we do have them at the PT level. So I hope I answered that question. Any other questions, Hannah?
Just one more question. Can the two verbatims be coded with two PTs?
Well, when you're coding two verbatims, if I understand the question correctly, when you have two verbatims, so you're receiving more than one bit of information in your report, and you're assigning LLTs, those LLTs route to PTs. And for those of you not familiar with MedDRA, every single preferred term is in itself does exist at the LLT level. So let me just take you back. So when we said, for example, accidental device ingestion, that's the first PT I see here. When I open it up, the LLT accidental device ingestion has the same numeric code, if you notice, as that PT. So every single preferred term exists on the LLT level. So you can theoretically be coding directly to the PT if that's your question. But when you code to it at the LLT level, it will be considered an LLT. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if that was the question, but if not, please feel free to give us a follow-up question.
Sorry, they just clarified one verbatim with two PTs.
Well, yes, if your report has multiple bits of information that cannot be captured in the same term in MedDRA, then you do need to select more than one. And that's what we were talking about when we gave the examples, chain of events here, when we gave this example. So this is one verbatim. This is one report that there was a miscalculation of the dose, the patient received the incorrect dose, the patient experienced hypotension. This is all bits of information received in one verbatim, one report. But we can't find one term in MedDRA, whether it's an LLT or PT, that captures all these bits of information. So this is an example where, yes, we do need to use more than one LLT or more than one PT to capture the story that happened completely, because we don't want to leave anything not coded and we don't want to add information. So one of the principles is don't add information, don't take away information. So I hope that answered that question. But for the purposes of time, we do need to keep moving because I do have a couple concepts still to go, and then we have our hands-on session. Okay, the next principle is the understand what stage of medication use process you're in. There are multiple stages in the medication use process, starting with storage or prescription, transcription, preparation, dispensing, administration, and of course monitoring after the patient receives the medication. Some medications require certain monitoring procedures to be implemented. So that HLGT high-level group term in MedDRA covers a wide variety of different stages of medication. So if you can at least know which stage your report occurred in, it will help you narrow down which terms you want to look through to find the best matching LLTs. And as we also alluded to earlier, some terms in MedDRA can capture the type of error, wrong drug, wrong dose, wrong route, wrong strength, etc., as well as the stage in the same term. So there are terms in MedDRA that capture two bits of information in the same term, like the wrong drug is prescribed or the wrong drug administered. It tells you the stage the medication error occurred and the type of medication error which occurred. But there are terms that don't have this ability. So there are scenarios where you cannot capture everything in the same term, and that maybe answers also the question we just received. So if the report gives you the stage and the type of error, but you can't find an entry in MedDRA that captures both, that's when you want to think about splitting them up. Okay, if you are able to capture both bits of information in the same term, that's the best approach. But if you cannot find both bits of information in the same term in MedDRA, then you want to split them. And of course, sometimes you receive a report where you don't have a stage, you only have a type of error. Then that's all you can code. And sometimes you have a report where you don't have the type of error, but you have the stage. You know that something happened during the dispensing stage, some error happened there, but you're not sure what the error was, whether they dispensed the wrong drug or the wrong strength or the wrong dose, or they gave it in a wrong formulation for route. You don't know, but you know it happened during the dispensing or during the prescription, etc., and that's all you can code. So here's an example where you can capture 2 bits of information in the same term in MedDRA. The pharmacy dispensed the wrong drug. So we already know that there is a term in MedDRA for the wrong drug dispensed, capturing both the incorrect drug, which is the wrong drug, that's the type of medication error, as well as the phase that this occurred in, which is the dispensing phase. So in this example, it's better to select one LLT for wrong drug dispensed rather than 2 LLTs, one for the wrong drug and one for the dispensing error. So if you do find a term in MedDRA that combines multiple bits of information, that's the best approach. An example where you don't find those bits of information in the same term is that they mistakenly prescribed the wrong strength. So we already know that this happened during the prescription phase, so I know the phase, and I know this was a wrong strength, so I know the type, but I can exhaust MedDRA and not find a term in MedDRA that combines both the wrong strength and the fact that this occurred during prescription. So I can't find a wrong strength prescribed. So my alternative solution is to capture it in 2 LLTs. And these LLTs will go to 2 separate PTs. So in this kind of scenario, I am coding a single verbatim to 2 separate PTs. Concept 6 is contributing factors, and contributing factors are crucial. They are very, very, very important. So please make sure you code contributing factors. And contributing factors are described as any circumstance or action or influence which is thought to have played a part either in the origination of a medication error or development of a medication error or increasing the risk of a potential medication error. The reason contributing factors are so important is because they are the root of mitigation activities. If you know why something happened, that's when you can stop it. So if you have a report that tells you that there was a contributing factor, please make sure that you code it. Same for a consequence error. A consequence error, like we said, is an error that followed an initial error. So if the initial error was that the physician prescribed the wrong medication and that the patient ended up taking that wrong medication, then we have 2 errors here, and we have to capture both of them, the originating errors as well as the consequence error. So we have an example. So this is an example where the doctor wrote a prescription by hand. His handwriting was really bad. So the nurse couldn't really read it, but she didn't want to ask the doctor to clarify. And instead, she made the assumption that, I bet he's saying this about this particular medication. But she ended up giving the patient the wrong drug with the wrong dose at a much higher dose than the maximum approved dose. And the patient went into a heart attack and ended up dying. Okay, a lot of information to deconstruct in this particular example. There was a prescription that was illegible. There was a drug medication error actually administered to the patient. There was clinical sequelae of that error, and there was an outcome of death. So how much information do I need to capture here? I don't want to leave anything uncoded. I don't want to miss any bits of information. So there was the prescription being illegible. That's my first starting point. So I know that my written prescription was illegible. I know that the patient ended up taking the wrong drug. I know that there was an overdose because the report actually tells me that the patient took an overdose of drug Y. So there was an overdose. And with the story unfolding, I know it wasn't intentional overdose. So even though the word intentional or accidental overdose is not specifically mentioned, this is a part of the PTC guideline that may be a little bit detailed in the overdose. You don't have to have specifically the word accidental overdose to be able to use the PT accidental overdose. It's not like off-label. If the story is telling you how the overdose happened and is clear that this was not intentional, you can select accidental overdose because it's more specific than standalone overdose. But what else is this report telling me? There was clinical sequelae to the patient. Yes, there was a heart attack, right? And there was a death to the patient, but I'm not capturing death in my coding if I'm set up to capture death as an outcome. So usually when we have death, and that's in the PTC, the points to consider document in the section pertaining to death, usually when we have information that tells us a story of a patient who eventually died, the death is usually captured as an outcome and as a seriousness criteria. But I don't need to code it because it's captured elsewhere. If the only information I'm receiving is that the patient died, and that's the only information in my report, that's when I can think of the different options of LLTs for death terms. Okay, and there's my very important contributing factor, that the prescription was illegible. Hopefully somebody talked to that physician that please print it out next time and don't write it out, because we want to avoid that happening. Principle 7 is about inference. We can't infer that a medication error occurred unless the report tells me to. So if I don't have enough information in my report that I'm receiving, my first step is to ask for more details if I can. So if I can ask for more details, if I can ask for more information about a specific report that I received, I want to pursue that option. Otherwise, this particular example is non-informative. So the nurse administered 50 milligram of drug X. I don't know if medication occurred in this scenario. It doesn't tell me. The report doesn't tell me. It's not giving me enough information. Was drug X the wrong drug? Was 50 milligrams the wrong dose? Was the milligrams the issue? Is that the issue here? Or was there something else? I don't have enough information. So this particular report is non-informative. And the last principle that we're going to be talking about is medication errors that are related to a drug delivery device. So MedDRA is a extensive database. It does have multiple terms related to the use of devices, but we have to be careful in our selection of these examples, because it could be a device use issue, meaning that during your use of the device, something happened. It might be a device complication, meaning that during the use of the device, a complication happened to the patient. And there could be a medication error if the device delivery did not work as expected. So you did not receive the full amount of the dose you were expecting to receive, or maybe it was more than you expected to receive. And there could be adverse events that are a consequence of this drug delivery device story. So let's see an example. So the patient was using a new pen, but due to the new pen design, the device was difficult to activate. The patient pushed the plunger as hard as he could and managed to deliver only a partial dose. So going back to that attendee, and thank you for your question, that had similar questions about, well, I have a whole story about a drug delivery device, and I have a lot of things happening. How do I even tackle this? So you want to ask yourself a couple of questions here. Was there a quality issue with the device? In this particular example that we're looking at, the quality here was about the design. So they're telling us, because of the new design, the pen was difficult to activate. The pen was difficult to use. So the quality issue here is that the design was had an issue with the design. They didn't exactly tell us what the issue was, but they told us that there was a design issue related to the story. But they also told us that the pen was difficult to activate. So using the device had an issue as well. So I have multiple bits of information here. I know that there was a product design issue, which goes to that PT. I also know that the delivery device component was difficult to use. So yes, there are these kind of intricate options in MedDRA when you are using a device that even goes to the level of detail that a device component was difficult to use. And that has its own PT for device difficult to use. And what happened next? Well, was there a medication error? Well, ask yourself, was this intentional or unintentional? From the story, it was unintentional. It all happened because of this design. The pen was hard to use. We pushed the plunger. We couldn't get the medication that we wanted. So the story itself tells you that yes, there was a medication error. Do I know the type and the phase of the medication error? I know that there was a partial dose in this particular story, and it was a result of the device delivery. So the partial dose delivery by device. So that preferred term of incorrect dose administered by device has an LLT that gives us the little bit of detail that says it was a partial dose. So this kind of shows you all the different possibilities that you can find in MedDRA, but finding those LLTs is a little bit challenging because they're not always going to have words within your reported verbatim. So again, going up to that HLGT and drilling it down, take your time, drill it down and look for different options and see if you can find the best suited LLT. Okay, we're gonna give now hands-on exercises. There's 5 of them, so we have 15 minutes left, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be enough for these exercises. So if you do have your ability to log into your web-based browser, again, you'll find the login information in the chat feature. So please do log into the web-based browser, and we're gonna go through these 5 examples. But remember to ask yourself a few questions. Was there intentionality in the example I'm going to be seeing? Who caused this event? Was the use under the context of a therapeutic purpose? That will help you answer the question, was this a medication error or not? And then what stage did this occur in? So was it a prescription phase? Was it a dispensing phase? Was it an administration phase? So what stage did this event occur in? And then was there an initial error that led to a consequent errors? Because if yes, then I need to capture more than one LLT. Was there a clinical consequence or harm to the patient? If yes, I need to capture that. Was there a contributing factor in the report? If yes, I need to capture that. And then maybe this was not an event that actually occurred, but they're talking about a circumstance that could have occurred, and this was a potential error. And of course, was there any error that was intercepted? So all of these questions will help us kind of zero in on which HLT I want to drill down in the MedDRA hierarchy. So let's get started with the first example. The nurse forgot to administer the second dose of the chemotherapy treatment to the patient. And I'm going to ask myself, do I know if this was accidental or intentional? I do know because she forgot. So I do know that it was not intentional. Who caused this? I do know. It's in the report. It's the nurse. Was this for a therapeutic purpose? Yes, I do know. This was for treatment of cancer. And at what stage this happened? I do know. She was supposed to administer the dose. So I do know that. Do we know why this happened? Well, no, I don't know. So I don't have the contributing factor. Okay, so your turn now to try and provide a selection of the LLTs you see before you. Which LLTs do you think, or more than one LLT, do you think best captures what's happening in this particular scenario? Okay, I'm starting to see the responses coming in now. So let's think about it again. Was this intentional or not? Who led to this event? Was there an initial error? Was there a consequent error? How much information can I capture in one term? Okay, so I'm about halfway of attendees, so I can maybe stop here and continue for purposes of time. So let's see the responses. Okay, so the majority are opting for a drug dose omission in error. So let's think it through. Okay, do I know if it was intentional or accidental? I do know it was accidental because she simply forgot. And I do know that it was the nurse, and I do know it was for a therapeutic intention. So I do know this was a medication error. And now when I go to my browser and I look up all different possibilities, here are the possibilities we gave to you, right? So let's think about them as to which one really matches it. When I look, for example, at scheduled daily dosing taken less frequently, that's telling me that something is continuing to happen. But my reported verbatim only told me that she forgot to give him one single dose. She forgot to give him one single dose. So this was not about the schedule. So yes, there was a drug dose omission. There's two options here, but was it accidental or not? And in my verbatim, I know she forgot, so I know she didn't mean to. So I know already that it was accidental. So I don't need this neutral preferred term here. And I do know that this was not about an unapproved schedule. She simply forgot. And I do know this was not a therapy interruption. Therapy interruptions in MedDRA route to the surgical and medical procedures. They're not medication errors. So yes, thank you for those who selected the drug dose omission in error. You did have the right option. Let's go to the next one. The patient didn't read the instructions thoroughly. They took drug X for prophylaxis instead of treatment of the approved indication. So they didn't read the instructions thoroughly. Do I know was this accidental or intentional? I do know the answer to that one because the story tells me this was not intentional. Do I know who caused the incident? I do know it. It was the patient or the consumer. Was this for a therapeutic purpose? I do know the answer to that. They were trying to get it to the therapeutic purpose. They may not have used it for the indication it was approved for, but their intention of using the medication was for a therapeutic purpose. Do I know at which stage this happened? Yes, I do know the stage in the verbatim. Do I know a contributing factor? I don't have that bit of information. So having answered these questions out of this selection, which one would best suit the story? Which one or ones would best suit the story? So thinking it through again, the patient didn't read the instructions thoroughly. They ended up taking this drug for prophylaxis instead of the approved indication. And those are the bits of information I'm trying to capture in my coding. So which of these options best suits this scenario? And I'm going to, again, wait till we reach about halfway through, and then I'll go and show the result. Okay, I'm about halfway through now, so let me show responses. Okay, so the majority are opting for unintentional use for unapproved indication. So let's think it through. So again, do I know if this was intentional or accidental? I know that this was not intentional. They just didn't read the instructions thoroughly. And who caused the event? It was the patient himself. Was this for a therapeutic intention? Yes, they did want to use it for a therapeutic intention. It was just not for that approved indication. So this was a medication error. And in looking at the hierarchy of MedDRA, what are the different options? So we did say that it was an unapproved indication. So we have two options here. We have the one that doesn't specify whether or not this was unintentional and one that does specify whether this was unintentional. My verbatim said the patient just didn't read the leaflet. So I know that it was unintentional. So out of these two, the unintentional use for unapproved indication is the most specific. There was no confusion with the instructions. The report that I received didn't say that the instructions were misleading or confusing. So this is not what happened. It's just that patient didn't read them thoroughly, and there's no mention of off-label in my report. Well, what about this one? What about the drug administration error? If we go back and take a look at this reported verbatim, I know that it was an unapproved, the use of a medication in an unapproved indication, and it was unintentional. But did the patient actually take this medication? So he did not read the instructions, and he took the drug for prophylaxis instead of treatment of the approved indication. So he did actually, in fact, end up taking the drug. So in this particular case, it is suggested to use the LLT drug administration error to capture all the bits of information in addition to the unintentional use for unapproved indication. So this is an example of maybe you want to consider more than one LLT to get the full picture. Okay, three to go. So example number 3, the patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. Do I know if this was accidental or intentional? I do have the answer to that in my report. They did take it for a specific reason. So I do know that this was intentional. I do know who caused it. The patient themselves took it. Was this for a therapeutic purpose? Well, yes, they wanted a better drug effect. Do I know which stage this happened? Well, yes, they took the medication, so I know this was administered. And was there a contributing factor? That bit of it is not really in my report. So what do you guys think? Which of these best suits the scenario that we're interested in? So the patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. And again, I'm going to wait until I'm about halfway there with responses. And like we said, the responses are all anonymized, so nobody knows who answered what, but it's a nice idea to participate and see if you get the right one. So the patient took more than the prescribed dose to get a better drug effect. Okay, I'm almost halfway there. For the interest of time, I'm going to move on to show the responses. The majority have selected intentional misuse by dose change, and then we have intentional overdose. So if we remember the definition of overdose, or the way it is prescribed in the concept descriptions, is that the overdose is either excessive or more than the recommended dose. I know that the patient took more than the prescribed dose. So the physician prescribed that patient a specific dose. It doesn't tell me it's more than the recommended dose per label, or that it was excessive. So I can't really say that this was an overdose. So I agree that this was an intentional misuse. Let's think it through. I do know that this was intentional. I do know that this was by the patient. I do know that this was for a therapeutic intention. So I do know that this was an intentional product misuse. And when I look at all the options in MedDRA, it was the best suiting option in this case was the intentional misuse, because it fulfills the criteria of a misuse. It was intentional by the patient for a therapeutic purpose. I don't know that it was really an overdose. So that part of it is not really provided to me. And the most specific term out of the options available is the fact that it was an intentional misuse. Okay. So here is the recommended LLT option at the end, the intentional misuse. Good job, guys. Okay, 2 more to go. Doctor prescribed drug A off-label for suppression of preterm labor after careful risk-benefit assessment. I think this is an easy one, because we do know this was intentional. We do know that it was the physician. It was for a therapeutic purpose. We do know that he prescribed this medication, and we don't have a contributing factor. I think this one is a clear one. So let's do a quick look at the answers coming in. And I do know I'm at the hour, so I'm probably just going to go a couple of minutes over just to give you the chance to see the last example, but I won't be staying on too long. So we are almost at the hour. And let's see the responses coming in. Yes, it is off-label. The verbatim itself tells me that this was an off-label. So the report itself tells me this was off-label. So walking it through, it was intentional by the physician for a therapeutic intention. And not only did it fulfill the criteria for off-label, the verbatim specifically told me this was off-label. So out of all the possible selections, off-label use is the best one. And the LLT, that it was an unapproved indication, gives me that little bit of detail as to what type of off-label use it was. The last one is that the doctor prescribed drug A. Just to summarize, the recommended coding is the off-label use and unapproved indication. The last example is that the doctor mixed up the drug names because they looked similar and ended up prescribing the wrong medication. Do I know if it's accidental or intentional? Yes, I do know who did it. I do know that it was for a therapeutic purpose. And I do know the stage that this was during the prescription phase. And in this particular example, I do know why it happened. The drug names looked alike. So out of the options, what do you think would be the best to cover all the information that we have in this report? The doctor mixed up the drug names because they looked similar, ended up prescribing the wrong medication. So what is the best option here to capture the story of what we have in our report? And let me just share the responses for interest of time. And yes, I'm glad to see those two options being selected. There was a wrong drug prescribed, and the reason for that is that there was a drug name lookalike. So let's think it through. I do know that this was accidental. He made a mistake, and it was the physician, and it was for a therapeutic intention. So there was a medication error. And out of all the examples or all the options that we gave you, we do want to capture the entirety of the story. So the wrong drug was prescribed, and the contributing factor is very important to capture because the drug name lookalike. This is the kind of information that's very important in informing regulatory decision making as to whether or not they're going to come back to you and say, can you please consider changing the name of your product because it's very similar to another product out there on the market. So the recommendation here is the wrong drug prescribed in addition to the drug name lookalike. Okay, so we've completed our presentation. Maybe I have enough time for just one or two questions, but I'll open it up now. Hannah, and of course, if we don't get the chance to address your question, please do submit it to us either with your email address, and Hannah will send them to me, or to our help desk, and we'll address them there. Any questions?
It is perfect timing. We just have one question, and it was about when you code one verbatim with two PTs, and they were just asking for clarification on if that will affect the frequency of reporting.
That's such a good question. So thank you for raising that. And it really depends on the way you're setting up your database. So double counting is when you have multiple PTs or multiple codes that really are conveying a single event or a single reaction. So you do have to be careful when you are selecting more than one PT, and this particular topic is addressed in our webinars for data analysis and retrieval. If you receive information that conveys more than one bit of detail that you do absolutely need to capture, you have to have a discussion with your organizations, with different members of your organization to understand the implication of that. And that's why some organizations have that one-to-one ratio where every verbatim can only have one code assigned in MedDRA. And then if you have more than one information coming in, you want to split that in your database. So you query the reporter and say, you are presenting me with more than one bit of information. Can you please split them up? Especially on the AE form. So on the AE form, if you are receiving multiple bits of information that can't be coded together in a single term in MedDRA, you do need to capture all the information, and that is referenced in the points to consider document. However, how you do that, how you go about applying that in your particular database, that's up to your internal organization's approach. Whether you have a one-to-one verbatim philosophy or a one-to-many verbatim philosophy. In many clinical databases, it's a one-to-one approach. In many safety databases, it's a one-to-many. So that's a very good question to discuss internally. So I do hope that I gave you something to think about and take back to your team for discussion. Any other questions, Hannah?
Nope, that is it.
Awesome. Well, we do have a lot of resources available to you. So we have our website. If you come across questions after the session, please feel free to send it to our MSSO help@meddra.org. We also have links to our browser. As a reminder, the temporary credentials will be available to you through end of the week. You can submit change requests if you are looking for specific medication error terminology that is not there in MedDRA. Please feel free to join us for future webinars on this topic. We do have a couple coming up in October. And of course, if you want to join us on any of the social media, please feel free to find these QR codes on our website. Thank you so much for your attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you on future sessions.